make certain that your budget is feasible in terms of year one outcomes, because year two is really dependent on achieving of year one outcomes. So because year two is outcomes based, you want to make certain that your feasibility for year one is on target to meet all said work plan deliverables. Okay, so there's a couple of things to consider when developing this budget itself. I forgot to mention, if there's any questions, or please reach out to the Q&A on the very top menu. We'll make sure we answer the questions at the end of the webinar. Okay, so a couple of things to consider for fiscal considerations and questions that may have come about is that there's no indirect on the behalf of your institution that needs to be added in here. So that's a stipulation. Out-of-state travels, like many other grants, needs prior approval. And no building improvements are to be included in the budget unless they are included in the matching column of your proposal. And again, this is because of the nature of the particular funding that comes from SB 1402, which has the stipulation of no building improvements. Now, regarding matching, matching itself can be from federal, state, or local funds, once again, except from SB 1402 or any funds coming from the Workforce and Economic Development Chancellor's Office. And that's the only stipulation we have about matching. Now, there is an Appendix C for which was covered through Tony's Edgerton's webinar. And again, those details you may or may not have in front of you, but please reference anything related to Appendix C for approved expenditures. And ultimately, if you have any questions regarding the expenditures themselves or the details of what's approved or not, please contact Tony at Sierra College, for which she has very good information about budget workflow as you need to produce for your contractual arrangements, as well as reporting dates that will ensue on this. One question that did come up, and that's the extension for your seed funding. If you have not received the memo, every college pretty much was extended, whether you requested it or not, so that you can spend out your seed funding, the total of the $40,000 that's extended. And again, you get the totality of the seed funding once you have backup material submitted to Tony. So you want to make sure that you're in contact with her for some timeline measure of that particular funding cycle. Okay, so those are funding questions that are going to be directed primarily to Tony when it gets to those levels of details. We showed this decision matrix map that back in I believe it was the work plan scenario. Well, we're kind of forwarding all the way to the very end where you're developing your work plan and the budget, and I highlighted that with a little red square. So this is assuming that you're already at that particular point. So of course, there's a lot of work being done at the front end with the startup materials and the implementation plan and your Maker Faire participation. But we're jumping ahead a little bit here where we're developing the budget and the work plan. Okay, so if you recall, we presented this once again in the this type of workflow process in our work plan development, where you still begin with your narrative question, with that prompt, addressing the objectives in your annual work plan, creating activities, developing performance outcomes, developing a timeline, and then identifying responsible individuals for this. So, but backing into that is, of course, the budget that's going to support all that activity and all those outcomes, and of course, the timelines that's necessary. And there's a lot of things to consider for the budget. Obviously, we have a list of possibilities down there, from curricular development, training, support staff, classified staff, materials, and of course, even time that you need a budget for individuals to oversee that. A lot of things. These are just examples of some of those items. So again, we're assuming we're in the implementation grant process for this particular webinar. This happens after the implementation plan. And don't forget the 3-to-1 match that needs to be achieved. And there was a question that came up, I think, in a previous webinar, that the 3-to-1 match can be used to achieve any of the 4 outcomes. So the scenario that there was I think in the previous slide where the internships were noted, but really It's anything of the outcomes themselves that the 301 match can be used. So just focusing on what you're going to see in just a moment is the budget, which if you see in the current slide that's in front of you, this is sort of the workflow that I'm going to demonstrate in just a moment in the budget sheet. There's going to be a sheet with a requested amount. Further budget detail will be developed, then the match, then review of the budget summary, then finally a budget narrative. And so the worksheets I'm going to show are in this order, although they're actually in that actual workbook, they may not be in this particular order. As a matter of fact, the nature of this particular development is iterative. So you're going to go back and forth to these several sheets several times as you work out the details for the budget. So it's not a linear, but even though I'm presenting it linear, you're going to go back and forth many times across the multiple sheets. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to the Excel file to show you live input and update. So your screens may flicker a little bit as I transition from one application to the other. And I'm going to go into that budget sheet demo in just a moment. I'm going to flash just one more time the email for Deborah and myself, and you can share those Dropbox folders to those particular emails that you see there. Okay, let me switch over to the Excel. Okay, in a moment you should see a your CCC Maker Implementation Plan Workbook Year 1, and I have it on the first tab, which is clearly says Do First. Please let me know on the chat window if there's any problem seeing the new window that comes up, which should be an Excel sheet. Any problem seeing the Excel? You should see an Excel with, it should say Appendix B, Do First. Okay, I think folks are looking at this. I don't see any negative responses. So the first couple of steps on this first sheet here is your selection of your school and your college. So I don't know if you can see these windows because I know Zoom doesn't pick up sometimes these pop-up windows. So I'll make sure that you understand that you should be able to find your particular college in here. So I'm going to pick, and by the way, all the colleges from our community college system are listed here. So don't assume that we have all these participants. I just copied and pasted from an existing list so that it just becomes a bit more transparent. So, what you see on your screen is just your selection of your district, your selection of your college, your fiscal year, and also the requested amount at the bottom. Now, that's one of the reasons why we want you to do this first. You may not know exactly the final amount for your requested amount, but be sure to enter something in here just to get things started. So I'm going to just submit $100,000 for the requested amount, because in this particular cell, it quickly jumps onto the budget summary sheet. I'm going to jump over to that and skip over the contact page and narrative checklist. Under the budget summary, you will see how your entered amount of $100,000 shows up in a couple of cells in here, and also the match required are automatically calculated. And that's really why that entry is necessary at the very beginning, so that you know what your parameters will be. I want to also point your attention, there's a couple of RFA numbers that show up in error here. That's just because I removed that one entry. You can either delete the RFA number or that whole cell in there. That's not necessary, so you can ignore that for the submittal. So once again, that's automatically entered into the budget summary sheet, and you will notice that there's a bunch of zeros under the funds requested as well as your matching required. And that's because you still have to fill out those two sheets, which I'm going to show next. So this is a summary sheet. This isn't an aggregate amount for which right now we have none. So under the budget detail sheet is where you're going to spend a lot of your time submitting information for the different categories that are representative of the 1000s, 2000s, so on and so forth, that your budget will constitute. If you're not certain about the categorical numbering system, you want to make sure you contact someone in your college that can help you develop a budget and put the right allocated amounts funds for what you're considering at in the right categories. And if you have any questions, we provided a budget detail sheet sample or that you can reference if in case you want to know what possible categories you can use. There are many more than these particular values, but these are the most typical categorical identification numbers that typically are used. But again, you may want to reference your institution to make certain that they match what they're using to track their budget. And eventually this will be rolled up to Tony's report as well. So for example, one thing that is always considered is participation of faculty in this award. So that's 1100. So when you go to the detail sheet here, you can type in 1100 for your full-time faculty stipends and budget whatever amount you will have for, again, this is year one. And you will notice as soon as you start typing in information into this, you'll see there's a side summative that is used for purposes further along, and then very much at the bottom you'll see how the total cost will be submitted as well in there. So you submit more information, for example, maybe an internship coordinator that you may be considering hiring part-time, and whatever budget that you dedicate to that particular amount. Again, you want to include the rate and the time. I'm just sort of typing in numbers here, so don't assume that's what you will use. Notice how the total cost is tallying up at the bottom. When you come to employee benefits, you may want to use a formula. Many of you are familiar with this, where you can type in formulas and submit the actual values that your college uses for that particular amount. So either 30% or any value thereof of your classified or your certificated faculty. Just make sure that you have the right values for your benefits so that they're calculated as well. So as you work through the supplies and materials, operating expenses, which include travel requests, food for some of your convenings, capital outlay for any equipment as well. So all of those information is put in here, and under the budget summary, they will be rolled up. If you notice, I'm going to go back to my budget summary where those summative amounts are actually being tallied in this one sheet. So same thing with the match. If you find your match sheet, it's going to look very similar with the same categories, 1000s all the way to 7000s, and you submit your matching. So for example, if there is going to be some facility work, you may want to include that in here and the amount, especially if you're considering the ventilation for your laser cutter or anything with electrical, any of those sorts. You may want to make sure you capture them in here, and you will see under the budget summary sheet how that match requirement is also noted from that one sheet. And you're going to work back and forth to make certain that whatever funds you requested match your detail sheet amounts as well as your matching amounts that are tallied up in here. And you can see at the very top, I highlighted mine in yellow so you can see them in this webinar. They won't be highlighted in yellow on your sheet, but you want to make certain that those amounts match exactly what you're requesting at the bottom. Okay, so that's how that works. And just to finish up the little demo here, because I want to get to the questions, you want to make sure that you also address the budget narrative, which is included in the process itself. Notice the point value here of the word max. And then lastly, you get into your annual work plans, which you may have already developed as part of this process. And that's the entirety of the rest of the sheet is the work plans that are included in here. Okay. So I'm going to now open, because I'm looking at the time. We have about 5 more minutes. I want to make sure we answer some of these questions. There's a couple of things also you may want to consider as you develop the budget. There's some questions if you're wondering how much people are expecting for certain equipment. You don't have to detail out the specifics in your budget detail sheet. For example, I'm actually going to go over to that right now. If supplies and materials is typically under $500, so here you can just put in like hand tools that you're getting from a vendor and approximately how much. Again, this is an approximate amount that you're willing to spend for hand tools. Let's say it's $10,000. Although individual tools are going to be, of course, much less than that. You can maybe group them together within one categorical expenditure fund, as well as any other equipment that's over $5,000 in here. You don't have to be detailed out with the make or the actual model. But if you know approximately that you're getting maybe some medium range 3D printers, you may want to note them here, and maybe you're getting 4 of them because you're choosing those smaller ones. And again, an approximate number that you're willing to spend on that particular line item, whether it be 3D printers or laser cutters. You want to make sure you have the envelope of amount listed so that you group it. If later on you're going to spend less than a certain amount in a particular categorical equipment supply, with an approval process of updating your budget and justifying why you're not spending that amount and where you're shifting that money to another category is definitely a part of the process that would come after your approval of the budget. So we want to make sure that you understand that you're just planning this budget, you're planning expenditures, but we don't need details at this moment of what particulars of the equipment, model, make, and those sort of details. Those may change. Maybe a newer model comes about in a couple of months after you receive the money. That may perfectly be acceptable. But again, if you're going to spend less or more, you will have to submit a change of this budget later on. So again, this will just be a detailed placeholder for future consideration. Okay, one thing that I recall that was asked is the Slack. Don't forget there's a cccmaker.slack.com where folks can share information related to maybe suppliers or how they can get in contact with certain vendors. Feel free to share those there as well. I'm going to switch over to some of the questions. Appendix C, that's an appendix that was submitted under the fiscal budget webinar, so please contact Tony if you don't have a copy of that. It's either part of your contract process, so your procurement office may have that as well, or you can find it typically in most chancellor's office grants. That's a very common appendix they put in most grants for the fiscal agent. So Sierra College has a copy of that grant, of that appendix. But most colleges have that when they get awarded any workforce and economic development grants. Okay, I'm just going to come over to the chat window or to see if there are any other questions. Oh, thank you, Tony. She mentioned how Appendix C is also in the Dropbox. Thank you very much. So that's there for anyone to review. There was a question about the matching. Does it start ticking on July 1st? That's a good question. It would start ticking once your award becomes official, and you can add that to your budget report. Presumably that is July 1st, since that's the new fiscal year. But I'm going to make sure that's correct. Okay. So there was a question about indirect. Indirect is typically the charge that colleges provide in grants to support the grant. So administrative support, budget support, fiscal support. So it's just a way to offset some of the time that people spend on this particular grant to support the grant. That's what indirect means. So your college should not charge any of that indirect. If you find yourself of necessity to gather information from vendors, from the internship assignments that will be happening through the foundation, all this other support that you need for this grant needs to be charged to the grant. So that has to be a budgeted line item for support staff, whether it be part-time, hourly basis of sorts. You need to determine the rates and the amount of hours that you're actually planning, and that should be included directly into the budget itself. So therefore, no indirect would be charged, but it should be charged directly with a line item of support staff. And then recall that you're going to submit the timesheets for this individual through their GLD from your fiscal office to show that this individual has been working there. So those sort of things are important to consider. Okay, I'm looking at the comments. It looks like a lot of them have been answered. Thank you very much, Tony. Thank you very much, Deborah and Carol, who's been answering some of this. Any other questions? I think I've reached my time limit for today. For those of you that are on this Friday afternoon, hopefully everyone has a great weekend. Unless there's any other questions, I think we're done for today. We'll see you on Monday for the Maker Faire webinar for some details about the presentation and also some details about the actual logistics of the sign up to help us out in our Maker Faire booth. There are some questions that came in here at the very last moment. If there's any questions about some of the details of where to put the categories, I would recommend to touch base with your fiscal office, which ultimately needs to sign off on this particular detail. So anything related to equipment, since it's budgetary dependent, depending on the cost and the quantity, you're gonna make sure you ask your fiscal office to make certain they guide you through that process, depending on the equipment expenses that you're considering. Okay. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for your time, and I will see you on Monday. Thank you very much.